I think we're all here now and our attendees are joining us this moment. So I'm just going to say a few words of welcome on behalf of Fourth Space. Just wanted to say good morning to everybody joining us here today on behalf of Fourth Space. Thank you for being here on this rather snow-capped spring day for what's sure to be quite an engaged conversation and reflection really on some of the major questions affecting us socioculturally today as we sort of navigate the consequences of our reality and the coronavirus. So welcome to all of the webinar attendees and as well to our live stream Facebook audience. We encourage your participation in the conversation via the Q&A option or in the Facebook comments. Your questions will be addressed throughout the conversation, so it's really part of the beauty of a live event such as this one. So without further delay, I extend a very warm Fourth Space welcome and thank you to our three panelists who will be introduced shortly, as well as Concordia University's Health Initiative Lead in the Office of Research, Shazma Abdulla, who will act as moderator for this discussion. So over to you, Shazma.
Thank you, Anna, for that kind welcome, and welcome to our audience. Thank you for joining us today. So a quick word of introduction. So I'm joined today by Marc-André Argentino. He is a PhD candidate in the Individualized program at Concordia University, as well by André Gagné, Associate Professor in Theological Studies, and Ketra Schmitt, Associate Professor in the Center for Engineering and Society. So we're joined here today by these esteemed colleagues to talk about our current situation, particularly in relation to how the current public health threat affects the relationship, or kind of brings to light the relationship between church and state, and tying in a little bit about how disinformation about the virus is spreading in these online communities that perhaps belong to these groups. As the WHO has recently noted, that we are not only in the midst of a pandemic, we are also in the midst of an infodemic. And so what is the impact of all of this information flying around, false or true, on our public health policy and public health outcomes? And what can we do to address these complex emerging issues? So we have quite a diverse panel with us today. So they'll each be bringing their individual perspectives from their research to kind of have a very engaged and layered conversation. And I think we're learning increasingly that interdisciplinarity is the key to having to addressing the complex sociocultural problems of today. And we know that this is not just a black and white issue, it's quite nuanced and layered. So, and that's something that our researchers at Concordia do very, very well here. So I'll allow them to introduce themselves a little bit more in detail shortly. But as Anna said, to our audience, we invite you to send us your comments and your questions throughout the conversation. We'll try to keep this as flowing of a conversation as possible. So feel free to send it in as we go along through the hour, and we'll address them throughout. Okay, so I'll go ahead and ask our panelists to introduce themselves briefly, to touch a bit upon their research and their perspective. Starting with Marc-André, if you'd like to kick us off.
Thank you, Shazma. So my name is Marc-André Argentino, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Individualized program at Concordia University. And I take a interdisciplinary approach to studying how extremist groups, whether religious or political, create propaganda, recruit members to their cause, inspire active violence, or impact our democratic institutions. I'm situated in the Department of Theological Studies. Andre is one of my supervisors, also in engineering. Ketra is one of my supervisors, and I'm also in computer science with my third supervisor. And the reason why I've placed myself in there is because when we're looking at complex issues, we cannot focus on these from a perspective of only soft sciences or the hard sciences. We need to have a mix of approaches to better understand complex societal issues. And I think bringing in various perspectives provide a better and more rounded approach to understanding when it comes to also providing solutions to them, rather than just commenting or criticizing them, which is how I'm trying to approach my research now on conspiracy theories and violence, but now shifting a little bit more to our new reality around the coronavirus and the pandemic that we are currently living through.
Thank you, Marc-André. Ketra, would you like to also introduce yourself briefly?
Hi, I'm in the Center for Engineering and Society in the Gina Cody School of Engineering. And my background is also interdisciplinary, focusing primarily on technology policy. So in my lab, largely we use systems models, including agent-based models, to look at different policies. And we do a lot of work around disease spread. At the same time, my teaching is focused on the impacts of technology on society, as well as engineering economics. And if we think of these things together, I think it can help us understand some of the broader social shifts that we're going to need to make in face of this new and also not so new way of living.
Thank you, Ketra. And finally, André, would you like to take the floor?
Hello, everyone. I'm Andre Gagné. I'm an associate professor in theological studies. And my research focuses around the Bible, its interpretation and reception in history, but also around issues pertaining to the charismatic right, dominionism, fundamentalism, the relationship between religion and politics, as well as religion and violence. Now, my work, I'm currently working on a book entitled Charismatics Behind Trump. And my work is focused on trying to understand these religious groups, especially in the US, what their thinking is, how they influence politics. And in the context of COVID-19, of course, we've seen several reactions from some of these particular groups in their resistance to the confinement regulations that were put in place. So these are my areas of expertise, and I'm looking forward to chatting with all of you.
Thank you very much for that, all of you. So I'd like to start the conversation off with you, Marc-André, a little bit, if you want to share some of the work that you've been doing most recently as it pertains to the digital space and extremist groups and conspiracy theories.
Yeah, so some of the work I've been doing recently has been looking at the origin of a lot of the conspiracy theories and disinformation that have been circulating around the coronavirus. And my focus has been on three specific groups. There's the conspiracy theory groups like QAnon, who are the pro-Trump conspiracy theory that has been around since 2016. I've also been looking at conspiracy theories circulating on the far right and as well as on the religious right. And all of these groups are intermingling with each other. And it has created an environment where there's actually been a mainstreaming of a lot of the coronavirus conspiracy theories, and it's making them a little bit more believable once they move out of these groups as individuals report on them. So I've been looking at how technology amplifies this, how algorithms present this type of content to people who consume them, and been trying to do a little bit more of the public scholarship and reporting about this and providing as much information about the origins of these. And I think one that is of particular interest right now is those that are circulating around the bioweapon, anti-government type of conspiracy theories, specifically around a vaccine. So there's some of the rumors that have been going on recently are really focused on the origin of the vaccine, if it's man-made or if it's natural. And one of the ones that are going from the man-made version was that this was created by Bill Gates. And I think this is going to be the case study that I'm going to use to help us go through the discussion today. So individuals were referring back in January to a patent that was owned by or under Bill Gates' name about a vaccine that he's trying to create to help defeat the coronavirus. Now, coronavirus is a type of virus. It doesn't refer to only this disease, but a whole branch of them. And this is the kernel of truth that starts as the core of a lot of the conspiracies we're going through. So now individuals are believing that he's doing this for as a way of monetary gain, let's say, because if he has the virus, then he also has the cure, and he's trying to have a way to make more money to enrich himself. There's others that are more of the political conspiracy theory that believe that a group of global elites are going to use this virus as a way of imposing societal control. So the whole fact that we're on a lockdown right now, that we're limiting our type of content we could post on social media because the platforms are working on this trying to censor us. It's a way of trying to control a population. And on the flip side, if you're not into the political conspiracy theories, you might go towards the more religious spectrum of that, where you believe that the virus is either part of some spiritual warfare, where it's not really a virus, but this is a punishment from God to, for whatever reason you want to believe, is God is punishing us because we've done a whole slew of terrible things. Some of which believe that God is punishing us because we've been attacking President Trump for 4 years, if you're more into the combination of the political and religious conspiracy theories. So we've seen this going through, and it's become mainstream now, as we've seen in the past week, where petitions to the White House to investigate the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for crimes against humanity or medical crimes, two have been taken down. There was a third one, I think, that was recent, that was taken down a few days ago, that had reached 300,000 signatories, which is 3 times the amount needed for the White House to actually take action. So now we're seeing where conspiracy theories that originated back in January are actually having political impact now, where we're going to have discussions on what do you do with an administration that is actually asked by a population to do this. The other question is now is there's a lot more conversation going on is what are we going to do with a vaccine if you have individuals in positions of power and a large grassroots community that believe that a vaccine is bad, or it's a way to enrich yourself, or it's a way for the devil to get inside your body. How are we going to have a conversation around inoculating a population against the coronavirus? We have seen how this disease and this pandemic has affected everyone around the world. We're going to need to have some serious conversations, not only locally, not only within our own nation states, but also globally about this. What is going to be the impact about if, and we would near a conversation of forced immunization for this? How do we have that conversation? How do you approach groups that may appear fringe to some of us, but are actually part of a larger movement, and there's a large amount of people who believe this? And I think one of the a way to look at this is Travis View did a interview this week on PBS, and he was saying that we're living in an age where conspiracy theories are promoted at the highest levels of power, when it was not long ago that conspiracy theories were the pastime of the powerless. So now we need to consider, when we're talking about these, it's not only individuals in their basement in obscure boards. We have journalists, we have academics, we have politicians, we have doctors, quote unquote, who may or may not have licenses, promoting alternative sources of cures, alternative healing, commentary on the value of vaccines. How do we have a conversation about this? And I think it's important from my perspective, this is where my research comes, is like, I need to understand the ideology, why people believe this, what makes them believe this. But then we also need to think about how we're going to approach this issue to actually, one, inoculate our societies, but also make sure that this does not happen again. And how do we prevent this? How do we prepare for months down the road when we need to have this conversation? And I think this is kind of how I'm looking at my research, from both the perspective and methodology I'm learning from Andre, but also the methodologies I'm learning from Ketra. And I think this is why a panel like we have now has some value to have the discussion now. I think it's a good way to maybe move down to the other panelists we have here to add some of their perspective to this conversation.
Yeah, that's a great start, Marc-André. Thank you so much for that. I want to pick up on your point about understanding where these ideologies come from and what the background is. And perhaps that can inform a little bit of the discussion about how we address this or talk to them. So André, I'll hand off the floor to you. Perhaps you can fill in that gap a little bit for us.
Yes, thank you, Marc-André, for this introduction. I think it's very important to look at, why some of these groups believe certain things. Of course, my area of expertise deals with the religious aspect. And we've seen, at least since the end of February, a lot of people coming out from, I would call the Pentecostal or neo-charismatic types of groups, mainly in resistance to this virus, and kind of challenging it and trying to offer some types of solutions to what it was, and trying to offer the people that follow them an interpretation about what this virus is. That it does it come from God? Is it something, is it a demonic spirit? Because there's people that address this as a demon. Essentially, they have the authority because they're Christians to take authority over the coronavirus. You've seen pastors on YouTube and other places, taking authority in the name of Jesus, blowing away, in one case, blowing away the coronavirus out of the United States. People like Kenneth Copeland, and others, simply taking an approach that this doesn't come from God. In some cases, it doesn't come from God, so we can fight it. In other cases, some other pastors or leaders will say it comes from God because it's sin. It's a consequence of sin in America, and God is sending this virus for us to actually bring us to repentance from our sins. And others see it more as a sign of the last days. We are in the end times, and Jesus Christ is coming back soon. And this is one of the signs that Jesus announced in Matthew chapter 24, for example, that there would be pestilence and things like that, and epidemics, or things that we find in the book of Revelation, for example, where there are mentions of plagues coming on the earth against those that rebel against God. But these are things in the last days. So essentially, we need to understand where these types of beliefs come from in order to address them. We need to understand that people that adhere to these types of ideas of confronting, of being bold against this epidemic, they have a particular way of reading, for example, the Bible, reading their own religious tradition. It's a kind of a subjectivizing hermeneutic where their own lives, their own life experience is transposed into the stories of the Bible. I don't know if some of you have been aware. For example, there was a woman close to the time of Easter that was interviewed, and she said she didn't worry about, it was on CNN, I think, she didn't worry about the virus because she was covered in the blood of Jesus. Jesus was her vaccine, in a sense. But where does that come from? So they read back into the Bible stories like the Passover story, and they apply this directly to their lives. In the Passover story, and I'll finish with this, in the Passover story, you have one of the plagues of Egypt in chapter 11, in chapter 12 of the book of Exodus, where God sends a punishment on the Egyptians, and there's an angel of death or destroyer that will come and wipe out, in that story, all the firstborn of the Egyptians, because the Pharaoh didn't want to let the Israelites go. He didn't want them to be free. But God was supposed to protect the Israelites if the Israelites sacrificed a lamb and put the blood of the lamb on the lintel of their doorposts. So when the destroyer would come to their house, he would pass over. This is what the Passover is. He would pass over that house. So they kind of transpose. You see, today they trying to transpose themselves into that story, and Christ is their Passover in a sense. So you have to understand how they read Scripture, where these ideas come from, and I think we'll have more to say as we go along. But I think this is very, very key to understand where these ideas come from.
Thank you for that, André. I want to pick up a little bit before we move to you, Ketra, about, can we talk a little bit about what's been happening in the US? So you had mentioned earlier that there were a number of oppositions to the directives that were given by the U.S. government, in particular certain church leaders. Andre, you spoke about certain charismatic leaders. Can we talk a little bit more about that and perhaps elaborate a little bit more about whether or not this is fringe? And then Ketra, you can maybe jump in to talk a little bit about the public health outcomes off of that. So Marc-André, do you want to fill that in for us?
Yeah. So just to reiterate about the fringe aspect of it, so looking at the type of content that's being shared online and the vast amount of it, we're no longer seeing this in obscure forums, in the sense that we have media outlets, whether you agree with them or not, that a large amount of the population actually consume, talking about this, whether they're seeing the virus as a hoax or the virus is not as it is. We've seen examples of where the virus has been associated to, let's say, 5G technology. So we've seen cases in, maybe not in the US, but in the UK, where cell towers have been burned down as the cause of the virus. We're seeing pastors have been arrested. So there was Rodney Howard-Browne out in Florida, and there was Tony Spell in Louisiana, who were recently arrested for disobeying lockdown orders. We've seen the protests that have been going on in specific states where people have been marching, not only to reopen the economy, some for valid reasons, because they do need to be able to put food on the table, but also there at those marches, you see individuals with signs relating it to QAnon conspiracy theories, to judgment from God. So you're seeing a mixed bag of individuals coming in this space, and we're seeing, I guess, grassroots movements that are looking to oppose the new reality that we live in, which makes a lot of sense in a way. It's understandable, but it is something that is a risk in the environment we live. And this is going from all different levels, where if you're looking at the US's reaction, different governors in different states, depending on not only their political affiliations, but their ideological beliefs, depending on if they're governors who are more biblical literalists, or if they're governors or politicians who believe in some of the conspiracy theories, their reactions to the virus have been vastly different. And you could even break this down to the county level, because of the way the US works. You could see that different levels of governments are reacting differently. So you could either have a micro or a macro impact on a population, depending on how these individuals are, talking about social distancing, talking about the seriousness of this disease, or talking about all other elements that are important to this conversation. And this is no longer, if you really want to go back to tinfoil hat individuals who are living in their parents' basements, but there's actually a large amount of the population. It's hard to tell how many, because there is no real polling about this, and like social media data can be biased because there is manipulation. There's other elements there, but there is a large amount of the population that does believe in this. And I think it's also important to highlight that it's not a bunch of individuals who are crazy. They're not crazy. It's people who really hold to these beliefs, whether you agree with them or not. And I think that's something that's important to keep in mind, that you can't minimize an individual's belief just because you disagree with it, but you need to be able to understand it, to approach it, because we need to find a solution, whether it's through policy implementation or it's through future preparedness or whatever else. We need to consider these, because we can't just say an individual who's going to look at this in a rational way. There's other elements behind it, and I think that needs to be part of the conversation.
Yeah, so you've spoken quite a bit about what's happening in the digital space, and that's translating to what we see on the ground. You related that a bit to the protests and the ignoring of the directives. So Ketra, I wonder what you have to say with regards to the policy implementations of this. I mean, I know we're localizing this a lot to the US, but I would imagine that there's policy implications that would affect us here in Canada as well. Perhaps you can speak a little bit more to that.
Sure. So I want to kind of go back to a few things that both Andre and Marc-André said, specifically in terms of the municipal and provincial and state level response. In both the US and Canada, we've seen variability, but a lot of actually great leadership, really good responses in terms of crisis and disaster. At the federal level across the world, I would say that is much more variable. And we've seen poor responses and moderate responses. Where I think the difference is the terms of the scale of planning. For decades, we have known there would be a ventilator shortage, not just in the case of a pandemic, but previously I did work on terrorism risk response and terrorism risk analysis, and I led economic impact analyses for a variety of different kinds of terrorist responses. And in those cases, we knew ventilator shortages would happen. There's a vast area that looks at disaster planning and disaster response. We knew we would have a number of critical shortages, including ventilators. So if you want to look at places that are doing a good job, that have enough ICU beds and enough ventilators for many scenarios, then you could say they've done a good job of listening to existing academic research. So I think in terms of governance, we can see really good crisis response, particularly at the more local levels. We can see places that are variable in terms of their long-term planning and listening to research and the voices of policymakers and a number of people, and places where that was not done. And I think if you want to think about the problems there, we can lay that at the doorstep of austerity and various measures to decrease taxation, limit taxation on wealthy individuals and businesses, and the places where cuts were made, right? And now we're feeling those very strongly. So I'd say that's where we have strengths and weaknesses, right? Crisis response versus longer term planning. And what I want to do today is relate this to our response on climate change, because in a large way, many of us are doing two things in response to coronavirus. We're saying, you hear a lot of sort of eco-fascist talk that look at all these great things that are happening with the environment. On the other hand, I think many of us are sort of taking our eyes off of that very important ball. And to my mind, what's happening now is a warm-up for the kinds of responses that we're going to need to have for climate change. And the responses that we need for climate change require collectivity. And that's where, not to minimize what Marc-André and Andre are talking about, but we actually have seen enormous amounts of collective caring response for one another to an unprecedented degree in almost any of our lifetimes. People are taking care of one another by doing maybe nothing, right? Staying at home, which is very hard. So we're doing something sort of transformative in our day-to-day lives. And this kind of collectivity is something that we need to take not just for COVID response, but also for climate change. We need to have this sort of collective and caring response. And certainly it's true that we've had these stay-at-home protests or people who are not listening to the orders. But I want to introduce something called availability bias, which is something that the media can greatly influence, right? In fact, many, many people are staying at home, right? The vast majority of people are listening and are staying at home. These protests are in very many cases very small. There are some cases in which they were able to block access to highways, block access to hospitals, right? In a way that is despicable. But this relates to availability bias, that we are believing we're seeing far more of this than actually exists. And there's another thing that really comes into play here, which is this idea of free ridership, right? That when most of us are staying at home, maybe other people have this ability to go out and be in public, right? For coronavirus, we need to think about protecting ourselves as well as others. So this idea of free ridership bias is less salient. But for climate change, which I see this as a warm-up to our climate change response, in the case of climate change, this free ridership bias matters a lot. So going forward, I see this as the three pillars of the response that we need to think about: our governance and our collectivity, our social movements, sort of individual action. So you're talking about social movements that are sort of negative, but I think we need to think about social movements that can be positive and increase our coronavirus response, but also our responses for climate change and a variety of other kinds of societal resilience. And then the other one is technology. But the main point I want to make here is that right now we're sort of waiting for a technology. We're waiting for a vaccine. And we're thinking about the technologies that can protect healthcare workers and other people at the front lines, such as personal protective equipment. And we're thinking about technologies to deal with the aftermath, such as ventilators. None of these technologies could work on their own. These technologies only work when they're put into place with strong policies and governance, and when we have social movements or individual responses that are using them and following orders. So I want to sort of situate this in this broader technology policy context and think about what are the things that we can actually do? What are the levers we can move? And that's what they are. Their governance, their social movements, and their technology. But technology only works in concert with these other two.
Thank you for that, Ketra. There's a lot there that we can kind of build upon and talk about. I want to return a little bit to thinking about the ways in which, or strategies that we can take to address these populations that perhaps don't necessarily buy in, to use a crude phrase, to what's going on, or don't necessarily listen to the health experts that we're putting on our televisions and things like that. So Marc-André, you spoke a little bit about the ways in which, you touched a little bit about the ways in which we can bring these people into the conversation, and until you give a really good background to that. I wonder if, kind of in the context of thinking about the actual impact that this can have on larger public health outcomes and policies, I wonder if you can elaborate on that point a little bit about how we can bring these communities into the conversation to compel them to think about public health outcomes in this context. So I'll leave it to either you, Marc-André, or Andre, to pick up on that.
I could start on that in a bit. I think it's important to keep in mind whether it's conspiratorial thinking or an extreme political ideology. Even when it's non-violent, these beliefs produce a whole host of societal harms. And research does show that, for example, that these type of beliefs or this type of thinking impacts an individual's trust in government, its trust in science, its willingness to vote, or even right now, it's the willingness to vaccinate a child or a parent or to take the proper medical advice. And what's important is that at a time when individuals in our society need to be on the same page, we're kind of reading from different books right now. So we need to figure out a common language to use and approach this. And it's not something that's easy to do, not only because this is not happening only in one region or in one country. This is a global phenomenon with multiple different political systems, ideological beliefs, different circumstances, because it's easy for us to talk about this from our North American, our Western perspective, but there is a whole other conversation to be had about what's happening in the global South with this. So even though we're looking at this, let's say from our first world problem perspective, there's a whole other host of issues that go on, because even if we deal with this here, which we have to first, we're going to need to consider at how we bring this to other countries that need to deal with this as well. And this trust in experts is where we're having an issue. We could blame a whole host of issues. I like to look at this from the technological perspective in a way, because we've seen how technology has impacted our behaviors. Populism over the past years has eroded trust in political officials, journalists, academics, whether for, in some cases, we may perceive this as valid reasons, or you may perceive it as a whole host of other issues. There's a lot that needs to be done that we kind of been sitting on and haven't been doing during our times of peace. And now that we're in this crisis situation, everything's coming to head. And I think points that Ketra was bringing up when she was talking is, you're talking about austerity measures. It's easy when everything is going well to look at cuts and making budgets and thinking, you're reducing X, Y, and Z. But when, we're in this crisis period, this is when we're feeling it. The impact of populism that have been going on, we're feeling that now. The free reign that a lot of technology platforms have had since Web 2.0, we felt that, more recently with where we're seeing the impact it's had on democratic institutions, but now we're really seeing it in a time of crisis when proper information needs to be put out. So we need to figure out a common way to speak about this, but we also need to rebuild I think not only from we, and I'm speaking as an academic, we need to start building trust back with a population that may not be willing to listen to what we have to say. And this goes whether if you're in the social sciences, in the arts, or if you're in, you know, medical science, which right now we really need that expertise and that trust. And it's hard when you have some individuals who claim to be from medical or are from a medical background going on large TV shows and just spewing a whole bunch of disinformation or hoax related content, whether it is for political ideologies or religious ideologies. We're getting into a space that is, we're going to see some public harm in the long run. And I think this is where we need to figure out how to speak to these individuals in a way that they understand.
I think this is a good time to move to a question that's come through from our audience. Marc-André, you were speaking about trust. Ketra, you were speaking with regards to community and sort of solidarity across our communities and looking out for each other. André, you've spoken a bit about narratives. So I'll read to you the question that came through Facebook, and we'll try and have a conversation around those three sort of areas in relation to the question. So the question that comes through from Facebook is, I'll read it out to you. I believe what we are seeing in the US has similar strains in other parts of the world. Marc-André, you were speaking with regards to a non-Western response. So for example, in places like in India, there are godmen and other people who spoke about how cow urine would help with curing COVID-19. And so the question that this person has is, how do we find the quote unquote fringe responses of this nature in different parts of the world? And is there kind of a commonality to the spread of this kind of misinformation? And is it possible to have a collective universal scientific response to this? So I'll punt it to whoever wants to take up that very complex question. Perhaps we can speak a little bit with regards to the spread of that misinformation, and then we can speak a bit to the response, if that works. So
I could lay out some groundwork and give room for Andre and Ketra to answer on this. But when it comes to fringe responses in different parts of the world, I don't know if we could still call these fringe, but let's say Côte d'Ivoire could be another example we give, where there's already been mistrust in that population about the response to the Ebola crisis, about how Westerners are coming in to provide medicine, are actually perceived as the root cause of the disease in the region. We've seen something similar like that coming out of Côte d'Ivoire with the COVID testing to see when they're doing to see if anyone has the disease. I've read or I've had conversation with colleagues from around the world. One of my colleagues from Malaysia was talking about the response coming from there. We're seeing a similar response from imams that are talking about how if you read the Quran, it'll protect you from the disease. Here, we're looking in a similar vein to what some pastors in the US are saying, where reading the Bible will protect you from this, or your belief will protect you from this. We've seen a whole host of new age medicines proposing different tinctures, different teas, different herbs that you could use to protect or boost your immune system. It is a global phenomenon. There's not one way that this spreads. It really depends on where you are. So if we, let's say in India, WhatsApp plays a key role in how this information is spread. We've seen Facebook change the way that actually you could forward messages on the platform since coronavirus broke out, where you could no longer forward to as many groups as you want. You're limited to one, trying to curb the spread of disinformation. You've seen other places where it could be via SMS in regions where you don't have access to 4 or 5G, you're using older technology, you're seeing text message scam. We've seen flyers being put up on street corners to spread disinformation, or on cars, word of mouth. This is not a new phenomenon. It is just augmented because of the crisis that we are in, where disinformation is being spread and it's having an impact. We're just seeing it on a higher level. And I think there's a bunch of ways to look at this, whether it's from its response or how it's being spread. I'll leave it to Andre and Ketra to comment on as well.
Yeah, just if I can sort of jump in to guide the conversation a little bit. I wonder, Andre, I know that you have a particular area of expertise, but I wonder if you can elaborate a little bit on narratives, and perhaps that being a way to speak to the issue and to these communities. And then Ketra, if you want to jump in on that and perhaps tackle the large question of whether whether, or strategies that policymakers can take with regards to kind of a universal response to this, and or perhaps in tech policy, or things that you're seeing in your work. So André, I'll hand it over to you to start.
Yes, concerning narratives, it's a bit complicated because we can't deal with all of these groups in the same way, because they have different ways of thinking. They have different, in my case, if I understand it from a religious perspective, they have different beliefs. They have different ways of practicing their religion. They have different sacred texts. They have different traditions. And this is where it becomes extremely important to be precise in how we address each group's concerns. And that is the challenge, because we need to know about these groups, and it takes time. We're looking for fast responses with quick fixes and quick information, but it doesn't work that way. And this is where education is important. This is where scholars should be involved in public scholarship, to kind of inform the public about these issues in a manageable way. It makes me think about one of the things that Ketra was saying about these groups. There has been positive responses by certain religious groups, and that we have to take into consideration. When we look at the situation in the US, for example, I zeroed in specifically on Pentecostal neo-charismatic groups because these were the ones that opposed the most these types of restrictions. And the reason for that is really rooted in their theology. They need to assemble. They need to get together and have the participants being part of their meetings. This is the raison d'être of their meetings. You see, it's participatory. So it becomes extremely difficult for these congregations to just sit at home and just passively look at a screen without participating in any kind of corporal worship, you see? But we need to understand that. This is a particular type of group that we need to understand. What probably is at the basis, maybe, of all of these types of religious groups that have these types of responses, is that we need to realize that a lot of their ways of thinking, or at least understanding their tradition, is pre-critical. We've changed our paradigm. Our epistemology is different. And like Marc-André was saying, there's a mistrust in education. There's a mistrust with respect to university. How do we gain that confidence? What types of, is there a possibility even for us to create narratives? The thing is, if we constantly bash on these people, if we constantly minimize their concerns, if we don't take seriously what they see as being grievances, if we don't address that, we're never going to reach them in any possible shape or form. We really need to be attentive, and because the way we respond it will either help, or what it can do is it could actually radicalize them even more. You see? So if we kind of just minimize how they think, and we don't even take care of actually understanding their worldview, even if we disagree, like Marc-André was saying, even if we disagree, but at least understand where these people are coming from, maybe after this, slowly, painfully, and it's going to take a lot of time, and we need to regain their trust, as it was said, but maybe some kind of dialogue in the long term can be established. And I've seen it in my courses. I've seen it in many different instances where, I was confronted with people that were really had a radicalized position, and it's just through time and dialogue and patience that eventually they come to change. But the change has to be seen as if they realize that they've made this change. You can't tell them what to think. You see, they have to come to those types of conclusions themselves.
Thank you. There's a lot to deconstruct there. I'd like to shift the conversation a little bit, kind of using that basis to to what we can do from a policy perspective, and perhaps a little bit from the perspective of you as educators. So Ketra, I'll hand the floor over to you. What do you think, how would you see policymakers building on some of the things that we've heard Marc-André and André say from your perspective? I know it's a large question, but
yeah, I actually, on the policy side, I think there's some larger, more complex questions that I'm not sure that I am able to tackle right now. I see this as an issue of looking at the incentives that drive news media, right? So I agree that we need to respect people and include them in conversations, but there's been a sort of journalistic ethic to try to appear even-handed, that journalists will try to present both sides of issues for which there are not two logical sides or two reasonable sides, right? So again, we see this with climate change, where climate deniers are given equal standing and equal time with science. So to me, to reduce this availability bias, it's really important that journalists present science and truth, and when things are demonstrably untrue and unscientific, to state that. I think there's been a little bit of progress made on that front in the US, where some news media are now saying, for example, when Donald Trump says things, or other politicians say things that are demonstrably untrue, to call it untrue, right? And to try to do so vigorously and immediately. But that response has been perhaps far too late for US democracy. So in terms of policy, right, this is where it gets really hard, because certainly everyone has free speech rights to say what they want to say, right? And the journalists and media outlets are under profit considerations, right? So it makes a better, bigger story that people are more likely to share and to use on social media if it has some outrageous side. This is a really thorny problem. And I, by no means, can say what I think the solution is. So I see there's sort of a ethical obligation, moral obligation, when we say that the free press is a cornerstone of democracy. I think the free press has fallen down. And the free press has fallen down for really obvious profit-related reasons. But I want to pick up on something that Andre said that I think is so important, and that is the ability of academics to create new narratives. Too often, we tell ourselves that our job is to be objective and do research. But we fail to tell ourselves another part of that job, which is we are civil servants. We are employed by the government, and our job, and the reason that we have tenure protection, is so that we have that same free speech ability to present our research and our ideas in a way that is not easily threatened by changing political winds. And to me, this is often called the Wisconsin idea, right? But this idea that the university has an obligation to society to try to help society and to be involved, whether that's creating narratives or it's 3D printing PPE, I think that is something that is on all of us. And I think at this point, as academics in particular, but as every citizen, we have an obligation to try to do something at this moment to try to combat COVID, but also climate, right? And so I later, maybe we can talk about some ways that all of us could engage more vigorously, even in this time of social distancing, to try to create better policies and better responses to make us more resilient as a society, not just in this crisis.
That's great, and there's certainly a lot to unpack there as well, Ketra. Thank you for that. I'm a little cognizant of time, but I do want to go to a question that came in via email. Perhaps we can touch upon a little bit in the last 10 minutes. What is the significance of the sunk cost fallacy in the conspiracy theory? So people have so much invested in their beliefs. Is it impossible to give up on fringe theories? There seems to be a sense of powerlessness and desperation in these people, and a search for simple answers and common villains. For example, the Jews, gays, communists, etc. That's a question that's come in from the US, from Hal Prentice in Michigan. So I wonder if we can also tie that in to the question of perhaps presenting a more, you were speaking a little bit to fact versus fiction, and sort of calling that out, Ketra. Is there a way in which we can tell a more compelling story too? We were talking a bit about charismatic leaders and the impact that has on communities. What do you think? Can you build a little bit on that, Ketra? And then we'll move to Marc-André and André to jump in on the question as well.
I love the sunk cost bias question. And there's a good deal of scholarship on how people change their minds and how difficult it is to get people to change their minds, right? And in particular, not only do we put a lot of stock into our own beliefs, but we actually take new information as buoying our own beliefs, whether or not it is. So there have been many controlled trials where people are presented, let's say, pro and anti-nuclear power groups, right? People will be presented with a study that is neutral or really does swing on either for the dangers or the safety of nuclear risks. And on either side of those arguments, people will say, see, I told you, this great study shows the thing that I'm looking for. And of course, these biases are only made larger because we have things like social media that do allow us to search for people who agree with us in the first place. So I think Andre spoke to the need for improving education. Certainly this is true, not just for social media literacy, but trying to understand scientific literacy, how we make our choices, humanities literacy, right? Understanding broader ways of knowing that are not just scientific ways of knowing, right? Those are also, I think, critically important to allow us to be critical thinkers, to allow us to think about other ways in which the world could work, and to have empathy and compassion for other people's ways of thinking. And in terms of specifically the sunk cost bias of people's arguments, I don't know. It is tremendously hard to overthrow one worldview for another. And actually, I would think Andre would be in a better position, or Marc-André, to answer those.
Yeah, and if I'll hand it over to you, Andre, in just a second. If we can also maybe address, there's another question that's come in. If you can maybe Marc-André or Andre address the ways in which, Ketra, you spoke a bit about social media propagating our own views. If we can speak a little bit to how to talk to people that continue to remain in an echo chamber, or how to prevent ourselves from remaining in an echo chamber as well, considering that, you know, we have social media, we use social media a lot. And what are some kind of practical tips that we can combat as well?
Okay, I could say a few words. Yes, it's extremely difficult to change one's identity because it's tied to our belief system. It's tied to a social group that we belong to. And this is where we get value. This is where we find purpose. Maybe for us as academics is to show that there are probably other ways to be in the world, to show other groups, how other religious groups can use those same scriptures, those same traditions, those same beliefs, and come to some kind of different conclusion. But it's very difficult to do that because these worldviews are they're very coherent, and you have to, when you enter into the rationality of how they build their arguments make sense. If you enter into their world, it makes perfectly sense. You know, it's very coherent for them. And this is why for us as scholars, we need to make the effort to actually understand these worldviews. And one of the ways, you know, you were asking about social media and things like that. Being active ourselves as scholars on social media, I think, is important to have. But that I'm speaking for myself. I know that it's not, like, not everybody is necessarily at ease with that or comfortable with that. But being active, I find in my situation, being active and really talking about these things in an objective way and presenting how these groups think and function is up to a certain extent, I think, helpful. At the same time, if someone doesn't want to stay in his or her own echo chamber, they have to expose themselves to these other worldviews. You have to go to the primary sources of these other individuals. You can't just listen to what people say all the time secondhand. You have to actually go and understand and dialogue. And even if you disagree, that's the best way to grow, to have all these types of perspectives. This doesn't minimize the fact that there are things that are true, that there are things that are correct versus things that are incorrect. And here, our job as academics is trying to shed light on that and why things are correct versus the things that are incorrect. But at the same time, it's extremely, I'm not going to change anybody's mind. The person has to change his or her own mind, but it's the way I'm going to present things in a non-threatening manner, in a non-accusatory manner, that can make and probably spark some kind of questioning. There has to be a cognitive opening at one point in the lives of these individuals where their narrative at one point fails them. And that's when we can, as scholars, step in and provide some kind of answers.
Yeah, I think that there's so many directions in which we can take this conversation. Again, I am a bit cognizant of time. If you three have a little bit of time to stay, just a few more minutes, if we have some more questions, that would be really appreciated. We do have one question, but I want to get to you, Marc-André. Do you want to touch a little bit upon the ways in which digital media propagates these views a little bit more in terms of how it works, so that we can understand what it is that we're engaging in when we do engage in social media, and perhaps that can lead to some thinking about strategies that we can take up in our own lives.
Yeah. Just to also touch a bit on the last question as well for the sunk cost, I think it's important to keep in mind, like Andre was saying, we need to understand these individuals. In my personal research, I've always tried to embed myself in these groups in a way to better understand. This is why I look at digital groups, what's digital ethnography. You need to view the world from the perspective of the group that you're talking about. And I think it also goes back to the question we had from Facebook about a universal scientific response. I don't think a response will be universal because there is no silver bullet. There are too many different circumstances. There's too many limitations. Every response needs to be tailored to the specific region, whether you're talking at, let's say, a city level, a provincial or state level, or a country level. And it needs to be tailored. Can there be a single technology, like Ketra was talking, if we're talking about a vaccine or ventilators? Yes, there's a couple of single things that could be useful across the board. But the way we approach it, the way we talk about it, and the way the information is presented has to be tailored, because the ideology and the worldviews and the beliefs of every individual involved is different, and that needs to be understood. And when we're talking about these individuals, whether it's your far right, your far left, I think it's also important not necessarily to minimize, and we're going to the aspect of public scholarship. It's really being there and asking questions. Ask them about their beliefs. Ask them why they believe this. Pushing the envelope, because to a certain extent, you're not going to convince them if you bombard them with facts. You're not going to convince them if you tell them they're wrong. But if you force them to question their belief system and to think about it, they may come to a different answer. They may not. But ultimately, the decision has to be that of the individual to an extent, because you can't force things, whether you're talking about building trust with someone who doesn't believe in the government or in science, or you're trying to de-radicalize an extremist. You need to have that aspect of conversation, and it's not something that is easy to do. And I think technology does play a role in this. And understanding the group is one thing, but some of the work that I'm doing with Ketra is also trying to understand the digital landscape, looking at, there's a lot of work on Twitter, there's a lot of work on Facebook. We're trying to keep a quick eye on Reddit and trying to see how these communities are talking about it. And it's a self-moderated environment. We're looking at a space where there is a need, in a sense. When the coronavirus started, in January, one of the key subreddits, our coronavirus, had 300,000 members. They're almost up to, they're over 7 million now. So people are flocking to social media to get information. Is the information they're getting correct? Not always. Are the people they're interacting with giving them information? Not always. Do they have their best intention? We've seen that. No, people have been selling colloidal silver, magical sprays, bleach sold as medicine to protect yourself from the virus, fake masks. So we've seen people take advantage of them. We've seen massive acts of kindness. We've seen, people reaching out, whether it's celebrating the birthday for a child who couldn't have friends, or, someone who lost their job and people sending money to this person to put groceries on the table. Social media and ideologies both could be beneficial, but they both could have nefarious roles as well. And it's important to keep that in mind. There is a lot of manipulation going on. It does play a key role. And I think it's more Wild West than it is, a safe space right now, because there's so much going on. Everyone's at home. People have a lot more time to be on here because, let's be honest, there's not much more for them to do. It is a very volatile environment. And I think it's important to keep that in mind, to build a toolkit for people to understand, to something simple like verify your source. Is it actually a journalist, or does it say anonymous? Is the article from 2020? I've seen articles from 2013 being shared as news right now. Is it a credible source? If you're always reading the same source, maybe you should read other media. If you're someone who tends to lead left-leaning news sites, read a couple of right-leaning news sites. It doesn't matter whether you agree with them or not. You need to have a whole view, because there's, like Ketra saying, information is framed in a specific way. They're trying to sell you something. They're trying to get you to click on the link. And I think it's important to have principles, not only in a crisis period, but in any period, to know what we're consuming and how we're dealing in this space. And I think that goes beyond, the coronavirus, but it's something that we could and should start implementing now in a time of crisis.
Just want to push back on that a little bit, though, because there is a tendency to try to show both sides of an issue. And again, not all issues have two sides, or the two sides are perhaps very close together. So there are some news sources that are quite consistently incorrect and push incorrect ideas, right? So I'm not sure that there's always value to trying to consider all of these different sources. Not that we should close them off, and certainly not that we should be rude or condescending to other people, but I don't think all news is created equal. And if you look at who funds news media, the types of stories that are chosen, even in quite mainstream media in Canada as well as in the US, I think we actually have quite a challenge in finding news that is actually unbiased, right? So I think there is quite a lot of bias. Certainly we should all read widely, but there are some news sources that are quite systematically wrong. And I don't think we should necessarily encourage people to look at those for more ideas.
And just to respond, not that I was encouraging people to read some of those wrong sources. There are terrible, terrible sources that you should not read unless you're interested in studying them. But it's more the principles of having a balanced media diet. Even if you're just going to consume a specific type of source that leans one direction, I'm not saying to the extremes either or. You need to consume a bit of both, because if we take some of the big names, CNN might report it one way, Reuters might report it another way, AP might say something else. They all have different ways that they get people to click on their sites. They want people to get that ad revenue, and you need to be aware of how this information is being presented to you and how to just basic fact checking to an extent, keeping that in mind. We're talking about, Zero Hedge, who's that recently been removed by Twitter on their platform, or Alex Jones and InfoWars that have been deplatformed. I think there's a reason they were deplatformed, and that's fine. And I don't encourage people to go read those. But you should also have a balanced diet, whether for your publication, that lean either way, and keep that in mind when you're reading your sources. But I do agree with you, Ketra. There's some sources that are just completely biased, and there's nothing to do about it.
It's such an interesting rabbit hole that we can go down, kind of talking about the media and biased versus unbiased news, and certainly another hour-long conversation that we can have on that, I do think that there, perhaps if I can add a little bit, there is something to be said too about the cues that we take, right? And this speaks a little bit to what all of you are talking about. You know, where we tend to go for our news sort of speaks to the cues that we take. So, for example, I tend to read academic literature just because of my training, and I also consume a kind of a wide diet of news, as you say, MA. But it's also important, as you've all said, to think critically, to constantly sort of evaluate your sources and your own worldviews, perhaps to evaluate that a little bit more critically and gradually as we go through and see emerging problems. So I just want to switch to another question that we've gotten, and I'll read the question out to you. And I think, Ketra, you might be the best place to sort of start the conversation off there. Speaking regarding vaccination specifically, how is the policy and legal landscape different in Canada from the US? And is it more or less difficult to mandate immunization here? And I think too that this speaks to questions that we can have with regards to uneven or disparate policy responses and how that might have an impact on public health. So Ketra, I'll hand the floor to you if you want to tackle that.
So one of the things when we talk about mandated vaccinations or mandated immunizations, this varies wildly between states and provinces, between individual school districts and municipalities. But one thing that's really important to keep in mind is that when you do mandate vaccination or immunization, that's going to impact people in profound ways and different people differently, right? So marginalized communities, the more we mandate things, the more we involve police, marginalized communities are going to be more impacted and more negatively impacted, first of all, as well as poor communities. Okay, but the second part of that is that there's some evidence that if we mandate immunizations, we will increase homeschooling. And once we have an increase in homeschooling, we have fewer checks and balances on children who could be at risk. Now, the majority of homeschool children are just fine. But if you look at the subset of extreme abuse, that happens much more so in homeschooled environments, right? So think about the conditioning there, but it is a risk, right? So you're actually putting children potentially at risk if you're increasing homeschooling. And there's, right, so the other thing is that people fake vaccines, right? So when we do have these requirements, there are ways to get around them, right? There are doctors who are anti-vaccine, right? As you alluded to earlier, Marc-André, just because someone has a medical degree does not necessarily make them qualified to dictate public health. And so there are, I'm really hesitant about mandating vaccination as much as I am completely pro-vaccine, and I see how transformative it has been for the public health, and it's something that I model. Mandating vaccination, I believe, is an overreach of governmental power. And I think it would be very likely to spark the kind of pushback that Andre, you suggested could happen, and Marc-André, well, maybe it was Marc-André that suggested could happen from different kinds of policing of ideas. I think vaccination, it's somebody's physical body. I think that could produce a lot of pushback.
Sure. So I think if no one has anything to add to that point, I'll go ahead and close up here. So just in summary, I think what we've learned is that there are varying perspectives that we need to account for when thinking about this issue. It's not so black and white, it's quite nuanced. And we do need to take kind of that nuanced approach when handling or addressing these emerging issues, and we've seen what the digital landscape has done to propagate some of these views, and just based off some of the things that we've seen out of the US and potential policy implications and public health outcomes that we can see. So What we'll do after the session, I think, and Anna can elaborate a little bit more on this, is share some of the resources if our audience is interested in seeing some of that and learning a little bit more. I just want to take this opportunity to thank all of you for joining us and to thank our esteemed panelists for sharing their knowledge and their expertise with us here today. Thank you to the Fourth Space team for partnering with us at the Health Initiative to put this on. Again, I think these conversations are always so important to have, and I think it's something that Concordia does really, really well in terms of that multidisciplinary approach, and we've seen that today. So thank you again, and thank you to our audience for engaging with us. Anna, I'll hand the floor off to you.
Thanks so much, Shazma. And yes, indeed, for everybody who's attended this, we will write you a little email thanking you for your time and giving you access to further resources for the reading on Facebook as well. I just wanted to say on behalf of Fourth Space, I would very much like to thank the 3 panelists as well as our eloquent moderator. Thanks, Shazma, for your time, your energy, and all of your insights. I think that this kind of conversation kind of proves the richness of engaging in interdisciplinary research and conversations, and that is definitely something that we have Fourth Space aim to facilitate, which I'd like to just say that on that note, we would invite all of you attending here today to follow us not only on social media at CU Fourth Space, but also keeping tabs on our website at concordia.ca/4 to check out the sorts of weekly upcoming virtual conversations and workshops that we will host in the coming weeks. Once again, thanks for everybody here today, and until next time.
Thank you.